Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the last installment of the 2021 Common Ground and Speaker Series events. What a year it has been. We have had some incredible presenters, and let me tell you, you are in for a treat tonight. I can't wait for us to get started. I do want to thank all of you who have been supporting us through the pandemic and through all of our programming, with special thanks to the Maryland Humanities and the Maryland Heritage Area Authority, who both have long believed in our Common Ground programming and are supporting programming and projects throughout this fiscal year. We want to thank also many of our community partners, including the Boeing Company, who is really supporting our work with equity. If this is your first time joining us tonight, welcome. We are so glad that you're here. Please do sign into the chat. Let us know where you are joining us from tonight. We can't wait to hear from all of you. If you're a longtime person who's been joining us through these virtual events, I know the platform looks a little bit different tonight, but hopefully you can still see the chat over to the side. That chat is also where you will put your questions for tonight. I don't see a lot of questions or a lot of things in the chat yet. Oh, there is Donald Barber. Thank you, Donald, for getting everyone started. Please, everybody, do sign into the chat so that we'll know that you're seeing this and you'll know where to put everything for tonight. We have some amazing programming looking already into the future in 2022. Know that though this is our last event for this year, we've got some incredible programming planned for next year, including Joseph McGill in January, who is with the Slave Dwelling Project. We also have a live in-person symposium planned for April and more, so it's going to be fabulous. Well, I'm now going to turn the program over to Jeannie Pirtle, our Director of Educational Programming and Partnership, to introduce our speaker for this evening. But I just have to tell you how beyond thrilled we were when he agreed to be part of our event tonight. What his focus on his work is so aligned with so many things that we're trying to talk about here at Solderly, and we couldn't be more excited. So with no further ado, let me turn this mic over to my colleague, Ms. Jeannie Pirtle.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you everyone for joining us. Please sign into the chat when you log in. Dr. Bobby J. Smith II is a sociologist and assistant professor in the Department of African American Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His research uses socio-historical and community-based approaches to analyze historical and contemporary struggles for food justice and food sovereignty in Black communities in the United States. Dr. Smith graduated summa cum laude with a Bachelor of Science degree in agriculture with a focus on agricultural economics from the historically Black Prairie View A&M University in 2011. He earned a Master of Science degree in agricultural economics in 2013 and a PhD in development sociology in 2018 from Cornell University. He has been awarded fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, National Endowment for the Humanities, Center for the Study of Southern Culture at the University of Mississippi, Special Collections and University Archives at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and the Medgar and Murray Evers Institute in partnership with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome, Dr. Smith, and go ahead with your presentation, and we'll make sure you, the audience, you may put questions in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. I am truly excited to be in conversation with Historic Solderly. I'm going to get ready to share my screen so we can get right into the presentation, but just want to thank you all again for the opportunity to be in conversation tonight. So I will begin to share my screen. One second. Can everyone see my screen? Yes.
Looks great. Looks great, Bob.
Thank you. So again, excited to be here. The title of my talk today is Food and Black Freedom, Reflections on Race, Resistance, and the Legacy of Food Justice. Because I got such a warm and great introduction, I won't reintroduce myself. I'm just excited to be here. Thank you to Nancy, Chrissy, and Jeannie for all of your assistance, and the entire staff at Historic Souderly for this opportunity to be in conversation at this last event of the year. So I'm excited to get right into the presentation. So I'll give an outline of the talk very briefly, and then I'll get into the reflection. So again, I see this talk as being a conversation, so please feel free to ask questions in the chat, any comments, anything there, and I look forward to the Q&A towards the end, at the end of my presentation. So I'll begin with a brief overview and background of my project and my research agenda, and then I'll define what food justice is. I'm talking about the legacy of food justice. I want to just ensure that we are all operating from the same definition of food justice. And then I'll get into a conversation about what it means to rethink the American civil rights movement through food. In particular, I'll be talking about what I call the food story of the Mississippi civil rights movement. There's one episode in this food story that I'll talk about specifically today and provide reflections, and I'll discuss an event known as the 1962 through 1963 Greenwood Food Blockade. But I'm going to do it in 3 acts. Act 1, I'll discuss how the blockade began. Act 2, I'll talk about a program that was known as Food for Freedom, which was a response to the Greenwood Food Blockade. Then Act 3, I'll talk about how the Greenwood Food Blockade ended. And then I'll conclude and have a few final reflections about the legacy of food justice, and in particular food and Black freedom. So we'll get right to it. This talk considers questions about the relationship between race, food, power, and inequality in historical and contemporary contexts of the Black freedom struggle. With these questions, I seek to understand how the politics of food enters the history of Black people here in the U.S. from slavery to today. These kind of questions consider how food justice activism shapes Black life, in particular the social, economic, political, and environmental and nutritional realities of Black people. More broadly, I'm interested in understanding this relationship between inadequate access to food, structural inequalities, and social struggle. So my research is kind of located at the crossroads of sociology, food studies, agriculture, Black studies, and history. This current project that I'll talk about a little bit today, which is a part of my larger book project, which is currently under review at the press, it seeks to really think about the civil rights movement. It seeks to rethink this idea of what do we think that we know about the civil rights movement. But before I get there, I want to first just define food justice, and then I'll talk more about the civil rights movement. So what is food justice? Food justice is a social food movement that is rooted in a historical set of ideological commitments, frameworks, and strategies designed to eradicate inequalities of race, class, gender, and sexuality reproduced in food systems and in society at large that contribute to the rise of hunger, poverty, and food insecurity. Food justice builds a capacity of communities to define their own food and agriculture systems. So that's the definition of food justice. And what I'm going to do with this definition is that I'm going to situate it within a conversation about the American civil rights movement and the broader Black freedom struggle here in America. When we think about the civil rights movement in America, it's often told through a political story. This political story is the prevailing narrative of the movement. Many of these episodes you see across this timeline from 1950 to 1970. I will say the civil rights movement operates before 1950 and after 1970, but many scholars, many activists, and many media personalities and many people who discuss the movement see this happening between 1950 and 1970. Many of these episodes are familiar, whether it's the Brown v. Board of Education decision or the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or Freedom Summer and the Civil Rights Act, or the murder of Emmett Till, or Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, or the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. See, these events are what we see as the political story of the civil rights movement. Many of these episodes center around education, voting rights, public accommodations, and things like that. But what's missing from this story, what's missing from our understandings is that when we think of the civil rights movement as just a political story, it renders the movement useless in many ways for understanding other issues today beyond our political and education systems. There are at least 4 episodes that are missing from this story of the civil rights movement when we think about it in terms of food. This is what I call the food story of the Mississippi civil rights movement. So when we think about it, these 4 episodes are situated within this conversation about the civil rights movement. But oftentimes we don't discuss them. Again, there are 4 episodes, at least 4 of them. We have the 1962 to 1963 Greenwood Food Blockade. We have the war on poverty. We have the founding of cooperatives. And again, this is what I call the food story of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, which is a part of my forthcoming book. These 4 episodes are critically important in helping us understand new ways of thinking about the American Civil Rights Movement. To be sure, there are a number of food stories that operate in our understandings of the civil rights movement, but I particularly focus on Mississippi. But instead of going through these 4 episodes, there's not enough time to really situate them. I want to talk about one episode in particular, known as the 1962 through 1963 Greenwood Food Blockade. To be sure, this event is unfamiliar to many people, but this event was critically important to activists not only in Mississippi, but across the nation. As I tell the story or lay out the story of the Greenwood Food Blockade, we'll begin to see just how important this event was. But also we can begin to understand, why don't we know about this event? Why is this event not taught in schools? Why are there no memorials commemorating this food blockade? It was such an important event, and I'll get more into talking about it. And this event, the story I tell is it draws from an article that I published in 2020 in the journal Food, Culture, and Society. The article is titled "Food in the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, Rereading the 1962 through 1963 Greenwood Food Blockade." So I think it's important first that we situate the context of this story. The food context of the Mississippi Delta. So the Mississippi Delta is this massive agricultural region located between Memphis, Tennessee and Vicksburg, Mississippi. It's located in the northwest quadrant of the state of Mississippi. It's heavy rural, and it's also the most populated area with Black people here in our nation. So the food context operates within these 4 different areas of Black freedom, white supremacy, agrarian rurality, and voter suppression. So the food context operates as a way for us to understand how the Greenwood Food Blockade impacted particularly poor rural Black people in the Mississippi Delta and civil rights activists who were seeking to address the realities there. The reason why activists found themselves in Mississippi was that they wanted to show that if we could change racism, if we could change some of the inequalities and eradicate them in Mississippi, we could do it anywhere in the nation. So the food context is situated between this idea of Black freedom, which is essentially the idea that Black people have the autonomy and the agency to define their entire lives. White supremacy counters or works directly against or in conflict with Black freedom, because it's the idea that the white population, that white people are superior, or that whiteness in and of itself, beyond people, operates and is superior above all people intellectually, morally, theoretically, and even in our everyday lives. But it's also agrarian and rural because the Mississippi Delta is heavily rural. It was built on plantation agriculture with cotton production. But also voter suppression was very critical there. I have an article about going hungry for freedom, and I'll talk more about that in a second there. But this is the food context, and the food context operates in plantation agriculture, in the plantation economy of the region. And in this plantation economy, poor rural Black communities who were mostly sharecroppers and their families access food in 3 different ways. The first way was through truck patches. Truck patches were usually small gardens located next to plantation shacks where sharecroppers were able to grow their own food. They grew food like collard greens, crops like collard greens. They raised chickens. They started hogs. They did a number of things next to, they grew peas right next to their plantation shacks. So you would have cotton everywhere, or any crop that was there, whether it's cotton in Mississippi or tobacco in North Carolina, or even rice in Arkansas. You had these plantation shacks where people would grow food right next to them in things called truck patches or truck gardens. The second way poor rural Black people, sharecroppers in the Mississippi Delta or on the plantations, access food was through plantation commissaries. These were stores that were located on the grounds where Black people were able to, sharecroppers were able to go into and get what they needed to survive on the land. Many times, oftentimes they went to plantation commissaries and they were able to get these food supplies and other supplies to grow crops from these plantation commissaries on credit. The third way many of them accessed foods was through the Federal Surplus Commodities Food Program. This particular program is critically important because when we think about the Federal Surplus Commodities Food Program, we think about government cheese, we think about flour and canned meat and peanut butter and things like that. And that is one of the ways that many poor rural Black people and sharecroppers access food, particularly in rural areas. but also in urban areas. But in rural areas, it took a particular way of operating, because many times truck patches were always at risk of being eradicated on plantations, because whenever there were good crop years, sharecroppers were forced to not grow food next to their plantation shacks, and they had to grow whatever the crop was to ensure that they could increase profits for their plantation owner. So in these three ways, what we begin to see is that Black people never had control of the ways in which they access food. They were dependent on a system or a context that was designed to keep them dependent on someone else for their food, access to food. And the Federal Surplus Commodities Food Program was the most important program there was, because many times when they couldn't get food from the commissaries or couldn't get food from growing it in truck patches and truck gardens, they depended heavily on this government program. But what we begin to see as activists come to the Mississippi Delta in the early 1960s, we begin to see a lot of pushback from plantation owners, from white businessmen, from political actors, because they saw voting rights as something that was impeding upon their own ability to be superior, or their own ability to reign supreme over that particular region. So we're very familiar with incidents where we hear about sharecroppers being killed, or we hear about sharecroppers losing their jobs, but also food was particularly important in this entire context as well. And what activists began to see was that before, with activism, they would just, they would kill activists or kill community members as a way to scare people away from voting rights actions or registering to vote. But as the 1960s came, and as activists began to flood the Mississippi Delta, food became an important weapon used against Black communities as a way to starve them into submission. So what we see, food as a weapon of voter suppression and as a weapon of white supremacy. And the Federal Surplus Commodities Food Program gets caught into this entire conversation. And Fannie Lou Hamer gives us a good quote of beginning to think about. Fannie Lou Hamer, one of the most important activists in the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, gives us a particularly important quote to think about this idea between food as a weapon. I do want to say, as a disclaimer, the language I use when reading quotes or talking about this particular context is language that was used then. Fannie Lou Hamer says, where a couple of years ago, white people were shooting at Negroes trying to register to vote, now they say, go ahead and register, then you'll starve. So what is Fannie Lou Hamer getting at? What's she saying by go ahead and register, then you starve? Because Black people were dependent on a system to ensure they had access to food. So as they began to push for voting rights in the Mississippi Delta in the 1960s, food was taken away. What do I mean by food was taken away? The Greenwood Food Blockade presents a moment where we begin to see food being taken away. So as activists are flooded, so before I go into the Greenwood Food Blockade, I think it's important to discuss why Greenwood is so important. Greenwood was once known as the cotton growing capital of the world. Some of the most cotton was grown in this particular region, in Greenwood or Leflore County was the place where many people came, or many people depended on, for cotton production on a global market. Greenwood was also in Leflore County, which is the home of one of the most, or the birthplace of one of the most important white supremacist organizations in the history of America, the White Citizens Council. Greenwood was also the place that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the NAACP and other activists gathered together to organize, to think about how can we begin to answer this question around voting rights and voter suppression and things like that. But the Greenwood Food Blockade begins on November 9th, 1962, when the Leflore County Board of Supervisors in Greenwood, because Greenwood also was the county seat of Leflore County, decided to get rid of the Federal Surplus Commodities Food Program. As I said before, the Federal Surplus Commodities Food Program was virtually one of the only ways that poor rural Black people were able to access food. So on November 9th, 1962, as activists found their way in Mississippi trying to organize sharecroppers around voting rights, there was a headline in the Greenwood Commonwealth, which was a newspaper there in Greenwood, and the line read, "Leflore won't have commodity program." On the surface, this seemed just like a regular, to the majority white readership of the Greenwood Commonwealth, this seemed just another article about a decision that government officials made. But what's interesting about this particular move is that this move comes just at the same time as activists begin organizing poor rural Black communities and going up against the system. While the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors argued that they got rid of the commodity program due to financial reasons, activists maintained that the program was taken away because of activism. Now, to be sure, the Greenwood Commonwealth did not call this a Greenwood food blockade, but a lot of the blockade played out in the media. So I'll draw upon a lot of articles to make this make sense as I begin to go through these acts. So this is the first time we begin to see the Greenwood food blockade begin on November 9th, 1962. Now, while activists maintained that the program was taken away because of their activism, the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors maintained that it was for purely financial reasons. But what actually began to expose this Greenwood food blockade was that activists began to tell the nation about the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors discontinuing this commodity food program. So what activists saw, or the narrative they maintained, was that it was taken away because Black people didn't have control of the food program. And the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors wanted to get rid of the program because they also were a part of the all-white political establishment in Greenwood in the Mississippi Delta. But as activists were beginning to spread this news about the Greenwood food blockade, Fred Ross, who was the State Department of Public Welfare Commissioner of Mississippi at the time, about 2 months after the Greenwood food blockade began, makes this speech. And he says that the race agitators who are going around and claiming that the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors are actually took away the program in response to black activism and the voting rights activism and the civil rights movement, if they continue to do this, he'll wipe out the entire statewide program. So what we begin to see is that food can be used as a weapon, but we also see that the power struggle that is clear here is that Black people did not ever have the ability to control the program, although they were the majority of the people who were benefiting from the food program. So we began to put this narrative together that initially in November, it looks like, okay, yes, the Board of Supervisors is doing this just because of financial reasons. But as activists began to expose this whole idea of the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors getting rid of this program, we began to see other actors across the state begin to say, if you all don't stop spreading this news, we will get rid of the whole program across the state. So in actuality, what Ross is actually doing is he's reinforcing this idea that food can be used as a weapon against Black people for trying to fight for their rights. What's also interesting about this is that as we begin to move, so we have all this happening in the news all over the nation. Activists from all over the nation are beginning to respond. So what they end up doing is they create this program called Food for Freedom. This is February 1963. Jet Magazine covers this Food for Freedom program, but they call it a food drive. But it's not just any type of food drive. Even on the cover, we see Step Up Drive to Aid Hungry Mississippi Negroes. Again, this is something that is particularly to understand because as we have the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors maintaining that we're not using food as a weapon, but then Fred Ross at the state level says if you all don't stop your activism or if you don't stop spreading rumors or spreading outright lies about the state withholding food from communities, then I'll get rid of the whole program across the state. So Jet Magazine begins to run Jet Magazine alongside other African-American newspapers begin to run a series of articles about this Greenwood food blockade. In particular, Black reporter Larry Steele says, after months of protesting and pleading, thousands of Negroes are being saved from starvation in the Mississippi Delta by voluntary distribution of tons of food and supplies donated from all over the nation. So again, this distribution of food and this food program was known as what we call Food for Freedom. A number of activists were critical in organizing this Food for Freedom program. So also in my book project, I do more work around this program and I lay out some more of the context. Again, because of the time of this presentation, I'm going to again reflect on the event, and then of course during our Q&A, I'll be able to talk more about this program and answer anything that's missing from this narrative so far that I've talked about. But what's so important about the Food for Freedom program is that while it was rooted in Mississippi, it had a nationwide impact. Activists from Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York donated hundreds of thousands of pounds of food to the Mississippi Delta, to activists there, to community members there, as a way to counter the effects of the Greenwood food blockade. In Chicago, they had the Give for Food for Freedom in Mississippi food drive from February 1st to February 10th in 1963. Dick Gregory, comedian, famous actor, Black comedian Dick Gregory, was at the forefront of this program in Chicago. Even Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. issued pleas for food for Mississippi during the Greenwood food blockade. And the program was wide-reaching. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Harry Belafonte, we have Dick Gregory, a number of people, even the Manhattan Borough president of New York City, all of them got together to donate food in response to this Greenwood food blockade. So this program was critically important. And the Food for Freedom program was designed as a way to ensure that Mississippi, people who decided to get into activism or poor Black communities simply had something to eat. But but what's interesting about this program is that while nationally, Dr. King and Dick Gregory and Harry Belafonte and a lot of men are being praised for their work around the Greenwood food blockade and responding to this event, Black women were actually at the forefront of this on the ground. We have right here Mrs. Fannie Hamer as well as Mrs. Vera Peggy. Both of their last names were misspelled in the Jet magazine article that I referenced earlier by Larry Steele. But what's interesting about this is that Fannie Hamer and Vera Peggy worked tirelessly alongside people like Ella Edwards and other people in Greenwood, as well as Clarksdale and other parts of the Mississippi Delta, to ensure that people had something to eat. But they understood and maintained that their food was purely taken away, not because of them, but simply because they were willing to buck against the system of white supremacy in Mississippi. Such an insidious act required Black people to respond in innovative ways. And the Food for Freedom program was this massive translocal program, pipelines of food designed to ensure that Black people had something to eat in response to their willingness or their want to change their conditions through civil rights activism. So Act 1 is when the Greenwood food blockade begins. And again, when the blockade begins, there's not some large announcement. It's fairly subtle until activists begin to spread the news that was common. A lot of things that happened in the South during this time didn't happen in mainstream newspapers like the Greenwood Commonwealth. You'd have to read about them in Black newspapers. But then Act 3, the Greenwood food blockade begins. So as activists are organizing and bringing food into Mississippi, they're also working with congressmen and other people across the state and the nation to pressure the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors to reinstate the food for the federal surplus commodities food program. This move towards trying to pressure supervisors to vote for the commodities again made it all the way to the United States Department of Agriculture. Congressman Charles C. Diggs in Michigan actually worked with the NAACP and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the USDA to pressure literally the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors to bring back the federal surplus commodities food program, because there was ample amount of evidence, because activists maintained and were able to ensure, or were able to show, that when we began to increase our activism is when the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors decided to take away our food, and then Fred Ross at the state level reinforced their narrative. So again, Congressman Diggs from Michigan worked with activists in Mississippi and across the nation, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to pressure the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors to reinstate the commodities program. As we see on the front page of the Greenwood Commonwealth. So we go from a small article in November 1962 to this large article in March of 1963 that the activists have pressured, the USDA has worked with activists to pressure the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors to reinstate the federal surplus commodities food program, and they did. But you see what's under this headline is, this was a time to resist. People believe that although they were pressured by the USDA, the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors should not have reinforced the federal surplus commodities food program. But what happened is that this idea, or this food weapon against Black communities, actually empowered Black communities to create their own food program, but it also empowered them to work with people beyond the education system and the political system, and work with the United States Department of Agriculture to ensure. As we see in this other column, it says, "Do it or else, agricultural officials tell the county." The USDA had to come to Mississippi and meet with the federal, to meet with the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors to literally get them to reinstate the Federal Surplus Commodities Food Program. Although the program came back and it benefited many poor rural sharecroppers as they were preparing for another growing season around cotton, activists continue to operate the Food for Freedom program throughout that entire time. So that's how the Green Food Blockade ended. But there's something about this event that's important for us to pay attention to. There's something important about the Greenwood Food Blockade. While it seems as if a small program or a small event, should I say, in the middle of a larger civil rights story, it teaches us something about today. Black activists today are working to remake the food system, as the New York Times system says. And at the forefront of this work are Black communities and Black activists, particularly Black women and youth, and young Black farmers who are continuing this work around food justice. And how is food justice connected to, or how is the Food for Freedom program and the civil rights story connected to today? And that even today, Black communities still don't have control or have the ability to define their own food and ag systems. The Greenwood Food Blockade made it very, very clear that even the system that's designed to ensure that poor people and hungry people have access to food is not controlled or not operating in ways that benefit Black people, or operating in ways that ensure that Black people have access to food. How do we create our own programs? The Food for Freedom program is one moment where Black activists connected this race question, this question of racism, this question of racial justice to food. And that's exactly what people are doing today. But in order for us to understand how food justice and civil rights are connected, requires us to recover things like the food story of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, moments like the Greenwood Food Blockade, moments where Black farmers created farms to ensure that Black people had something to eat. Food is mundane in many ways, but food is critically important in this story about Black people. And when we begin to recover this food story, we learn new things about the civil rights movement, but not only new things about the movement itself, but we learned that people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Dick Gregory and other people were thinking critically about this food question, because they understood if Black people can't even control the food they eat or have something to eat, they won't even be able to go vote. They won't even be able to promote freedom. So I like thinking about this food story, and I'm passionate about this food story because I think it helps us understand just how transformative food can be. And what's interesting about this Food for Freedom program is that once the Food for Freedom program happened, it actually increased the number of people who were willing to go out and participate in voting rights activism. So also as a lesson for today is that Black people today are still hungry, are still the hungriest population in the nation. Just recently, the Economic Research Service of the USDA released their food security numbers. And while food security stayed the same amongst populations during this time of COVID, Black communities' food insecurity increased. That means that more and more Black people were at risk of not being able to access food that could boost their immune system and have the ability to access nutritious food. So again, as I reflect on the Greenwood Food Blockade, as I begin to reflect on food and Black freedom and the legacy of food justice, I see what activists are doing today as directly a part of the genealogy that the food program is also a part of. So I look forward to our conversations about the Greenwood Food Blockade. In my book project, I take time to literally lay out the Greenwood Food Blockade and the conditions and circumstances surrounding it. So I'm looking forward to our Q&A because it'll give us a chance to really engage in conversation, and I can actually fill in some of these parts of the narrative. So I'll end here and just say that I think there's something important about the civil rights movement, and particularly the food story, the food story of the Mississippi civil rights movement, that can help us understand why people are thinking about generating local farms in Black communities. These questions of urban gardens, these questions of food programs in Black communities, low-income communities of color, poor white communities. These kind of questions about food justice and building the capacity of communities to take care of themselves is directly a part of what activists were doing in the civil rights movement some 50, 60 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. So everyone, put your questions in the chat. And Nancy already has a question up here.
Perfect.
Can you tell us about some other instances of food injustice during the civil rights movement?
I can. I'll just wipe myself off real quick. It's always so interesting giving a talk, and not being able to see people, but I'm excited to answer that question. So were there other instances? Yes, and there were a number of other instances. So one instance for sure was one instance that we had happen was the idea of cooperatives. Cooperatives became a critical part of this conversation. Black-led cooperatives, food cooperatives. So Fannie Hamer created the Freedom Farms Cooperative in the late 1960s because what they recognized was that the federal government is not going to ensure that poor rural Black people in particular have access to food or able to actually access food through government structures, because at any moment they could take away the program that they did with the Greenwood Food Blockade. So the Greenwood Food Blockade is like the first moment of this food story I tell, but then I also talk about the idea of Black cooperatives, and that's one important part of this conversation, is that Black people created their own food programs and food cooperatives as a way to ensure that they could feed themselves and not be dependent on local governments or federal government structures to feed themselves. And there's also other episodes where food was used as a weapon against Black communities as well during the war on poverty era. So we see these moments where the Greenwood Food Blockade is just a window onto which we can think about other instances of, or other episodes, if you will, during the Civil Rights Movement.
Thank you. And Diane Davies asked, how does the Flint water crisis relate to this topic or food deserts?
Yeah, so the Flint water crisis is yet another moment where, so for us, it became, it made mainstream news. What we do know is that people were struggling with water issues in Flint before the Flint water crisis made it to our front page news or to CNN. And what that crisis connects to, and when it connects to food and food deserts, thinking about, if you don't have access to quality water, then you can't cook, then you can't wash dishes, then you can't even begin to think about preparing certain meals. Water is important, and again, and when I say water, is in clean water to ensure that you're not contaminating your food. So the Flint water crisis is related to this topic because in order to have food security, you have to have water security. So many people are, so for example, something as small as thinking about cooking ramen noodles. A lot of poor people depend on ramen noodles to eat on a regular basis. But to make ramen noodles, you have to have what? Water. So if the water is contaminated, you can't even make one of the only foods you can even begin to consume at the time. The water crisis brings up this idea of food and things like that, because in order to have food security, you must have water security. But also to grow crops, you want to have access to clean water as well, to promote healthy soil. So the Flint water crisis was a moment that we began to look at these questions around food security, is that water is critical to our ability to be food secure.
I'm going to ask you to elaborate on something while I wait for, it's not too late to join the conversation, folks, so keep putting your questions in the chat. But can you elaborate on this difference? What I noticed is that to overcome the power, really it's a power grab, to alleviate a program that people depended on. In order to do that, you figure out your own programs. So and this is something I think people get confused about, so I wanted you to talk about it a little bit. It's like the difference between, say, and don't get me wrong, I think we need to do charity. That's not what I'm talking about. But food pantries and actual food equity. I think there's a lot of confusion about that. Could you elaborate on that?
Right. So food charity and food pantries are a stopgap. They're a part, they came into prominence in the 1980s. Into prominence more in the 1980s. And food pantries and charity is just a stopgap. But for us to begin to think about this idea of power and equity requires us to understand the ways in which systems are designed to ensure that some people are food secure, some people have access to food and the food they need to live healthy lives, and some people don't. And the systems that are in place, particularly, thinking about the federal government system, thinking about food stamp program, thinking about all these programs that are, again, designed not as a way to promote equity, but as a way just to get people food in the meantime. But this question around equity requires us to allow people to decide when, where, and how they want to access food, but not just access food geographically, politically, and socially. So charity is important, but charity does not get at disrupting the system or get at actually giving people power to decide their food futures. And that's really where our conversation really begins in thinking about food justice. It helps us understand that inequalities are reproduced in these systems, and we have to understand that while people are getting food through charity, and again, I don't think that we should get rid of charity. I think charity plays a major role in ensuring that people have food, but also if we're going to think about how to address these larger conversations about hunger and poverty, then we're going to need to begin to think about the systems that have been put in place to ensure, again, that some people are food secure and some people are food insecure. So I hope that kind of gets at your question, Jeannie.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Elizabeth Gill, you mentioned how they still don't have control over their own food. Does this look different now than it did then, or is it still the same methods of control?
That's a good question. In my book project, I carried this food story of the civil rights movement through today. It looks different. It looks different because the food landscape is different. For example, back then, poor rural Black communities depended wholeheartedly on their ability to grow their own food or the federal government to access food through the Federal Surplus Commodities Food Program. Now we have the food stamp program, and many people depend on that. But also, let's think about the food environment of many communities, rural Black communities, rural urban Black communities that are filled with fast food restaurants, a place where they can get unhealthy foods. So you have this food landscape that people are forced to navigate. They don't have a choice. They have to go to McDonald's. They have to go to Burger King. They have to go to these places. And again, nothing's wrong with eating McDonald's, once in a while, or Burger King every once in a while. The problem is that that's their only way of accessing food. And because the food environments are built a certain way. So it looks different today because the food landscape looks different, but people still don't have the ability to control what comes in and out of their neighborhoods. Thinking about the Flint water crisis, communities didn't have the ability to control what kind of water they got. The water got pumped into their neighborhoods. That's what they were able to get. Fast food restaurants get put in Black communities. Liquor stores get put in Black communities. These outlets where you get unhealthy foods get placed in Black communities, and Black people are forced to navigate these landscapes. And the powers that be are not thinking about ways to ensure people have access to nutritious foods. They just want to make sure they have access to some type of food. So I would say that it's different today because the landscape is different. But Black communities are still trying to figure out how can we define our own food and ag systems and ensure that we can control our lives and even our food lives as well.
Okay. Lane Murphy, in regards to the Flint water crisis, how do you feel race played an impact on national recognition coverage of the problem, especially considering the inadequate dirty water supplies on a lot of Native American reservations?
Yeah, no, that's really important. I think there's no way of getting around the race question in any of these crises, whether it is a COVID-19 pandemic crisis, even in the Greenwood food blockade, that's a crisis. The race question is always important there because you see a neighborhood or a city like Flint, probably Black or a huge Black population that again is forced to not be able to decide their realities, not be able to decide their futures. And the race question played a major role in it because there was no way that people could turn their eyes to the fact that these Black people were forced, or these poor people were forced to navigate such terrible, deplorable water conditions. But even on Native American, even thinking about the question around Native American reservations and places where, or even historically thinking about these kinds of questions, race is at the forefront because we still begin to see that people who are non-white are forced to not have power in deciding their realities or shaping their futures. And again, what happened with Flint was also that the media played a major role, because a lot of people the media journalists were able to go into archives and begin to see that while we call it a Flint water crisis, that was everyday realities for the people who lived in Flint. So it was a crisis for us, but for them, it was like, we've been having bad water. They've been not caring about us. So how do we begin to raise recognition? But even today, the Flint water crisis is still not being resolved. The food crisis in Mississippi, still not resolved. The race question is at the center because we see time and time again that it's Black people, poor people, people of color, communities of color, that again don't have the power to shape their realities or decide their futures.
Are there examples from Mississippi of Black women organizing to feed the resistance, similar to Georgia Gilmore in Montgomery?
Yes, yeah. It's funny you mentioned thank you for the question. Georgia Gilmore's pop-up eatery during the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. What people don't know about Georgia Gilmore is that her pop-up eatery, her basically her restaurant where she fed people up from the back of her house, played a major role in funding the Montgomery bus boycott. So we see Georgia Gilmore's pop-up eatery. We see soul food restaurants doing that, whether it's Pascal's, whether it's Peaches in Mississippi, or Pascal's in Atlanta, or Doogie Chase's in New Orleans. But then we also see Black women developing farms, cooperatives. We see Fannie Lou Hamer doing that. We see Elsie Dorsey doing that in Mississippi. So not only was it just about, and again, these farm cooperatives were directly related to political activism, because again, Fannie Lou Hamer and other people understood that when we begin to organize, people are going to start losing their jobs. People are going to start, food's going to be taken away from these people. And how do we begin to organize through food? So Georgia Gilmore is an early example of how Black women use food to fund the movement. But then we see, as the movement goes on into Mississippi and other places, we begin to see, so not only are we creating food programs, but then we want to grow our own food. We want our own land and our own farms and our own ways of doing this work. And again, Fannie Lou Hamer, Elsie Dorsey, Shirley Sarad in Georgia, these people began to place the food question, but not only about food as a way to fuel the civil rights movement, but food as a way to fuel people in their everyday lives, activists, and even people who are not even in activism. But the question moved from a political question about activism to this idea of sovereignty and liberation. Thank you for that question about in referencing Georgia Gilmore's.
That was from Paula Johnson. Thank you, Paula. Nancy, you mentioned community gardens as one possible solution to food insecurity. But have you heard of other projects that are having a measure of success in communities of color?
Yes. So one great example is in Detroit, D-Town Farms. Mr. Malika Keeney founded D-Town Farms, I want to say probably some 10 years ago now. Well, actually, no, it was 10 years ago when I was in grad school. So maybe some 15 years ago now, I think it was 2006, he founded D-Town Farms. D-Town Farms is doing amazing work around this idea of Black people in Detroit, Michigan. And again, it's important because Detroit is a place where a lot of Black people live, but also a lot of them live in places where they don't have access to grocery stores. Many Black neighborhoods don't even have grocery stores. So Malika Keeney and a number of people in his community decided to start the D-Town Farms there. We also have Afro Green in Fort Worth, Texas. It's a group of young Black people who decided to get together to create a number of community gardens and urban farms throughout Fort Worth, Texas. I'm from Fort Worth, Texas, so I'm very familiar with Afro Green down there. You have Sankofa Farms out there in Durham, North Carolina. Kamal Bell is doing amazing work with young people around beekeeping and community gardens. They've been very successful. You have the Good Food Revolution, a group of young rural Black people in Mississippi that I write about in my book, who are doing work around farming and food marketing. And again, they've been very successful because it's been context dependent. Kamal Bell's doing work based on what's happening in North Carolina. Afro Green is doing work based on stuff that's happening in Texas. D-Town Farms is doing work based on what's happening in Detroit. So these community gardens are not just popping up just because people need food. It's also popping up because it's in a particular context where structures and systems, there's no grocery stores. Grocery stores have ran out of these neighborhoods, or cities have decided that we don't want to zone grocery stores or give them access to spaces. So there's a number of vacant lots in these neighborhoods. So these community gardens, these programs rise out of a specific context, just like the Food for Freedom program in the 1960s. It didn't come up just because Black people needed food. It came up because they didn't have access to food in places where they should have had access to food. So we've seen a measure of successes in Detroit, in Texas, in Mississippi, in North Carolina, but it's happening everywhere. There's places in Maryland, New York, Los Angeles. You name a community of Black people, and they're thinking about this food question, and they're fairly successful, but they're also always at risk because many times community gardens, people don't own the land. So now we see the land question being important. If we're going to create a community garden, let's make sure that we own the land on which we put the garden on, because if we don't own the land, at any moment, the land can be taken away. So again, what happens with these community gardens is that there's the questions of vulnerability, is that people are so vulnerable to systems and structures and policies that at any moment land can be taken away. At any moment, my food stamps can be taken away. At any moment, my grocery store can be taken away. And because of this, people are living in times where, and then you have a pandemic happening. So I need food to boost my immune system. I need food to survive. I lost my job, I need food, but there's no grocery store in my neighborhood. I can't get food stamps. The community garden down the street doesn't own the land, and they're getting ready to have to move around. They can't produce enough food to feed all of us. And this food question is so critically important. So people have been successful in context, but all of those 4 projects I just named, they're considering, how do we sustain our programs? How do we ensure that people have access to food all the time, reliable access to food, and how are structures and systems in our particular context working against their abilities to get food?
So what are some steps that our local governments can do, and state governments can help the process of empowering people to secure their own food sources?
Right. And I want to say that I think what's important too is that community gardens are important too, but also people having the ability to decide whether they want grocery stores or whether they want community gardens or how they want to access food. And this question about the local government and state government is important. The first step, which is, I'm going to say it, and it seems so simple, but local governments and state governments can't really get this question right, is go to these communities and ask people what they want. It's amazing that a lot of these community garden programs, why they've been so successful, or urban farms, urban gardens, or even these urban grocery stores have been successful, is because they have asked the community, what kinds of food do you need? And how do you want to access that food? So if local governments, so often people hold these hearings, these local hearings or these statewide hearings, but they're during the day. Or there are times where people who need access to food can't even get to those programs. So in order for local government, state government, one step to empower people is by going to those communities and taking seriously what these people need. But 2, also not making promises that you can't keep. So often politicians and state actors go into communities and say, hey, if you vote for me, you do this, I'll be able to ensure you get X, Y, and Z, and then you don't follow through. So the first step, 1, is listen to them, go to them and get the answers. But then 2, make sure that you don't overpromise, and make sure that you use the resources you have to ensure they have access to food, which is also why the Greenwood Food Blockade is such an important event to think about. Because as I said before, the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors decided to stop that program. The LaFleur County Board of Supervisors were all white. So majority of them didn't even use the program. But you had people like that making decisions for everyone. And the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors were people who were voted into these roles or voted into these offices. So the question of voting rights was always there, because many people believed that if we had the right people in office, they would have never discontinued that program. So local governments and state governments can do their due diligence by 1, talking to communities, but then 2, using resources to actually ensure that what people want, they get. I get there are government structures, and I get the will of bureaucracy is slow. But also I understand that there are things that can be done in the meantime to ensure people have access to food, but also to ensure the resources are there to ensure they always have this access. So the two steps I always think about when doing this particular work or thinking about Black communities and food is that actually going into communities after 5 o'clock. In these, these steps seem so simple, but state actors, and local governments are not going into communities. If they do go into communities, it's on their terms. So this question also brings me to another level of this: on whose terms by which are people controlling their food system and accessing food? I would argue that in the Black freedom struggle, Black folks want to also decide the terms by which they access food. And when working with local governments and state governments, another step can be on what terms do people want to access food? And I think that's some of the steps that can be done to empower people. Because if you empower people by giving them terms, then they would be willing, if you will, to work alongside government structures. But historically, we found that government structures have not operated in the best interests of their constituents.
Thank you. And Paula wants you to shout out the name of your book.
Thank you.
Heidi asked for you to shout out your name. And Paula asked, are land reparations happening in any significant way in Black communities?
Got it. Thank you, Paula and Heidi. So first off, my book is called Food, Power, Politics: The Food Story of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. It's set to come out within the next year. It's currently under review at the press. After it goes in review, then I get it back. I do. So it's a process. It takes about a year to produce the book, but it's currently under review at the press, and it should be out within the next year, at the latest spring 2023. It'll be published by the University of North Carolina Press, and again, it's called Food, Power, Politics: The Food Story of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. And I'll be sharing more about the book in the months to come. Land reparations, yes, that is an important part of this conversation around food and Black farmers, because historically, Black farm land has been taken away from Black farmers for a number of reasons. So land reparations is a part of it because, again, you have an entire group of Black people who are saying, if we're going to feed ourselves, then we also need land justice. We need our own land, because if we have our own land, we can decide when, where, and how we grow food, who gets the food, we distribute the food, and things like that. So land reparations is an important conversation, particularly in this food space, but also in thinking about housing, and thinking about communities. If we have our own land, we can create our own government structures, or our own structures, or vote our own people into these government offices. So land reparations is a huge part of this conversation. It's happening, again, in multiple communities, but it shows up in different ways, Paula. What it looks like in Fort Worth, Texas, might not look the same in rural Mississippi. What it looks like in Detroit, Michigan, might look different in Chicago, Illinois, or here in Champaign, Illinois, where I live. So the land question is important, but it shows up differently in different contexts. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. And we'll have to have you back when your book comes out.
Yes, please. I
already know that. So yeah. So I don't see any more questions in the chat right now. So I'm going to turn it back over to Nancy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bobby, that was amazing. There's so many people with, I think a lot of us are still learning parts of what happened during the civil rights movement that we weren't aware of. And the fact that in that time frame, food was actually being used as a weapon. I think that's something that a lot of people just aren't sure, really didn't know. And I didn't realize to that extent when you were telling us tonight. And as I investigated a little bit more, we knew you were coming on. And, as you were talking about Black communities needing to have access to land, or even community gardens, I know one of the things that we've run into here at Solderly, one year we were willing to make the land open to community gardens. Transportation is a really big issue down here in Southern Maryland. And so if you can't easily get over to the land to work it.
Right. And Nancy, I'm so glad you said that, because I have conversations with my colleague Dr. McMillian a lot. She's a colleague here in African American Studies, and other people. We talk about these questions around food all the time, and transportation is so important. Nancy, thank you. I usually mention that a lot because that's also a part of who's at the state and the local level. Felicia Russell said in the chat, she said representation in government decision-making structures matter. And that matters because if transportation is an issue, how can we work with our local governments and our local officials to ensure that, counties and these organizations and these companies can get people the right kind of transportation? When I lived in New York during graduate school, that was one of the number one issues. People were saying, so we don't have a grocery store and that's fine. Okay, we can get around that, but we can't even get to the grocery store because the bus lines only run from 8 to 5. I don't get off of work till 5 o'clock. I can't get to the grocery store till 6, and the last bus runs at 6:30. So I have to be able to leave my job, wait for a bus, then take another bus to the grocery store, get groceries, and then carry all of them back to the bus stop and get there within 30 minutes and then try to get home. So I'm so glad you brought up transportation because that is such an important part of this conversation. And again, so if people don't have a grocery store, how can I even get get the right kind of transportation? Because bus lines are revising routes all the time. And a lot of time the best routes are those who live in places where there's like a main thoroughfare. And a lot of these communities are near main thoroughfares, but they're usually offset from these thoroughfares, these intersections. So, wow, thank you, Nancy. I usually bring that up, but again, this transportation question becomes
it's inextricably linked because here in a more rural community, and I understand why it's the case, this isn't throwing my county under the bus, but they tend to go in one big loop.
Right,
so if you're going from here to here, then you have to get home, you have to go this way to go get it.
Right.
So opening our land up though, as I mentioned to you, we're doing a Growing for Good program, which, as you mentioned, really is more of a stopgap measure, growing food on our land, getting it to local food pantries to get at least nutritious food out there. It's not allowing people to come in and do that. But if after a long day at work, how are you going to find a bus to get over here to work the land before it gets dark to go back home? It's not going to happen. It's so inconvenient.
It's so important. And even me myself, this is the work that I do. So these are the kind of questions I think about all the time, like clockwork. And even my sister, we talk about where I'm from in Fort Worth, and places like that, where again, grocery stores and things like that, and transportation, and even in bigger cities like where I live in Fort Worth. Most people have cars. So growing up, we didn't even no one thought about taking the bus because it was just so out of the way. You had to walk 2 miles to get to the bus. It's getting better now because everybody wants to go green now and those kind of things in urban areas. So they're doing better routes. But even growing up in places like bigger cities like that, you don't think about it because transportation isn't designed to go to every single corner or where these people are located. But you're right, in rural areas, it becomes a whole nother conversation because of resources. Does the county have the money to invest in a system that can have multiple routes? Even where I live here in Champaign County, a majority of the routes are centered around the university. And if you live outside of the university sphere, it's kind of tricky to navigate how to move around the area. So transportation is another side of this food justice, and people are fighting for more routes. And in some cities, like in places like Baltimore and other places in New York, and even where I lived in Ithaca, they were asking, can we get at least one bus route that goes past 8 o'clock, so people who get off of work at 5 can at least get to the grocery store, get somewhere before you all suspend routes. And they were very successful during that time. So the transportation question is critically important.
And you mentioned another thing that is so important. I mean, we have one of the few food deserts in Maryland, down here in Southern Maryland, outside of the Baltimore area. I mean, we have one right down here. It's not just about, access to land. It's access to something other than, like you said, everybody's eating McDonald's, everybody's eating, fast food at some point. But if that's all that's close to you,
right.
Those are the choices when you're looking at what businesses are you allowing to come into these
right. Right.
Are you actively seeking businesses that will give healthier options to those in the area rather than just the fast food places that will have cheap food, but is it nutritious food?
Right.
encouraging those, that's a whole economic development as a whole different
and Nancy, what's important about what you're saying is that actually in many ways, these food deserts aren't deserts at all. They're these produced spaces that are filled with or saturated with questions of development, questions of economics, questions of social, political, environmental questions. So we call them food. The USDA calls them food deserts, but honestly, these places are places that are produced. They're not a natural phenomenon by no means. And some people even use language like food apartheid because you begin to see that these food deserts are segregated. They're not everywhere. You just don't go into a city and see them everywhere. Some neighborhoods are designated that way and some don't. And we have to begin to compare these areas. It's almost like layering. So we start at the level of who lives in these communities where people have access to food. Then we layer with who are their representatives at the state and local level. Then we layer with what do these people look like? What are their race? What's their class? And then we layer it again with what kind of companies are allowed to even come in, and what grocery stores were there and why did they leave? And these are the kind of questions that people aren't asking because people don't think about food in these ways because our relationship with food has been shaped by DoorDash, Grubhub, grocery stores, TV dinners, convenience. So our relationship with food doesn't even force us to consider these questions. But also, who has time to go to the grocery store and think about all of these kinds of questions? So my own research agenda is really about taking these questions seriously and then working with communities to ensure that we have the language to think about food and power and politics and the language of our struggle so that we can make it clear to the mainstream. So what activists in Flint did well was that they were able to create a narrative around the water crisis there that went nationally and globally. So we have to figure out how can we create a narrative around food that can make it to the national level. I mean, food just became a big deal due to COVID. Bread lines came back. People are still, even while we're talking, people are waiting in line in particularly rural areas just to get a food box, to make it food box full of spaghetti sauce and maybe some fruits and vegetables just to make it to the end of the week and frozen chicken nuggets. I know this because I actually worked with some programs in summer of 2020 around distributing food in Mississippi. So, this food question is big, but it's never at the forefront of our nation's conversations. It's never at the forefront of our conversations around history. But food is critically important in my work and a number of other scholars. Our work is designed to recover and uncover these food questions to get people around, to galvanize people to take seriously these questions around food in the nation.
And I loved when you said, so often we're trying to project what we feel the answer should be. Right. Go into communities and ask, what do you see as the biggest need? What are the solutions you're hoping for so that, if we look at what the end game, what the desired end game is, maybe then we can work together for solutions. Right. But if you don't go after hours when it's convenient, because everybody's working these jobs that don't have the flexibility for you to say, I'm going to take an hour out right now and I'll be back. Most jobs are not flexible, especially for the people who, the people with the least flexible jobs are the ones who are in the front lines. Food services are barely squeaking by anyway. They're the ones that you can't just say, let me go out for a little while so I can attend a meeting. Right. Go in, they need to hear you.
And that's so important because even like I'm going to about food service workers, fast food restaurant. It's so many one thing about food is that it connects to so many different things. And I even remember when I first got here to Champaign County, and I got invited to a program of a food meeting about trying to organize a community food program and garden and food bus that would go around the area, in particular areas to provide food for people. And as the meeting was at noon. And I couldn't I went to the meeting and everybody that was there, they were there because it was during the work day and it was a part of work. And I literally stood up in the meeting and I'm like, I'm trying to figure out how we're going to try to talk about addressing food insecurity in particular communities. And everyone here is food secure and it's noon. So those who are working class are at home. And it's these kind of things. And then when I raise the question, people are like, oh, wow, we never thought about that, because we're so used to doing things the way we do things. It's going to require us to answer this food question, to rethink all of our models of how we organize and address problems in our communities. So it's going to require those of us to not use our work day to have meetings, but actually go after 5 and 6 and have these meetings in apartment complex clubhouses, have these meetings at neighborhood spaces that people hang out at. It can't be at the Department of Public Health at noon, because the bus is not going to run by the public health during the day. People can't leave work, because by the time they leave work at noon, they're going to get to you at 12:30. Then the next bus comes at 12:40. And you want them to come for 10 minutes and tell you about their lives. And then they go back living it, and you get to decide what they want. So I'm glad. So I'm very, I take that kind of stuff, those things seriously, because I've been in a number of different food spaces, because I've also, I'm an activist as well. So I'm a food justice activist. So I do work around food justice and community. And every time I go to these meetings, it amazes me, because no matter how many times you say it, these meetings are, you still get a doodle that gives you timing from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. And I'm just saying to myself, we're not going to, we're working against our goals. And then when it doesn't happen, or people or these programs are unsuccessful, it's not our fault, Nancy. It's the community's fault, because they didn't buy in. It's the community's fault because they didn't show up. But we decided on our terms what the community should do, instead of on their terms what we can do to enhance their food security concerns.
Bobby, I knew, oh my God, I knew you'd be a great finale this year. I knew it. I mean, what you're talking about, that our present has been crafted by our past. And you set that tone for us very clearly tonight, that the things that we're still experiencing now have historical precedence. This is not something new. And one of the things that we talk about with our Common Ground programming is just what you were saying. We need to step into somebody else's shoes, hear somebody else's voice. Because if we're just listening to our own voice, or the voices that we've known and that are comfortable to us and that are the ones that we think are right, then we are not seeing what's really going on out there. And we need to really have those conversations with people. And sometimes they're not going to be comfortable. And we just need to understand that.
Right.
But it's only that way that together we'll be able to have the right conversations. And I'm just so grateful to you. We are going to have to get you down to Sauderley. I'm bound and determined we're going to get you down.
Thank you.
We'll have to have you with us to continue the conversation. But thank you again. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. This was an incredible conversation. I know that we're all going to be buying your book, Bobby, when it comes out. You got to let me know so I can shout it out to everybody.
I will. I will let you know. Right.
We're all going to want to watch that. For all of you who joined us tonight, I'm so glad. If you missed any of the other programs this year, they're all on our web, hyperlinked off of our website. You can watch them at any time. We will have Joseph McGill from the Slave Dwelling Project coming to join us again for the third time in January. Joseph is a longtime friend of ours, and we can't wait to have him back. Mark the last Friday and Saturday in April for our symposium that we're going to have this next year. But every month we're going to be having amazing programming. Jeannie has lined up some absolutely wonderful ones. We hope that you'll join us. They will be just as inspiring as tonight was. Bobby, we cannot thank you enough, my friend. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you to all of you. We hope you have a great evening. We'll all get your book, and we'll continue to learn more. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Take care. Thank you.